Kale Vasic had not slept in 31 hours, and his hands still smelled like reactor coolant and burned rubber. He walked through the massive food court on Celestine Ring Station with his shoulders low and his boots dragging against the polished floor, leaving faint black streaks behind him like a wounded animal leaving a trail. And he did not care because every muscle in his body was screaming at him to sit down somewhere, anywhere, and shove something into his stomach before he collapsed. The atrium was enormous, a domed hall the size of a small city with an artificial sky projected across the ceiling that shifted between sunset colors and deep blue, and it was packed with hundreds of species, eating and drinking and laughing and arguing, and every single table Kale could see had bodies crammed around it, shoulder to shoulder. He was a human, which meant most of the alien species in the atrium barely noticed him, and the ones who did looked at him the way someone might look at a stray dog that wandered into a fancy restaurant. He did not belong here, and he knew it. Kale was a mechanic from Dust Mara, a scrapyard colony on the edge of nowhere, a place where people fixed broken ships and broken machines, and lived on leftovers from a galaxy that had forgotten they existed. And the only reason he was on Celestine Ring at all was because a merchant captain had hired him for an emergency hull repair, and then refused to pay him the full amount, because Kale had used a patch weld instead of a full seam replacement, even though a full seam replacement would have taken 3 days, and the captain had screamed at him to finish in 1. So here he was, underpaid and exhausted and starving, in a station full of people who made more money in a single meal than he made in a year. He scanned the atrium one more time, desperate, and then he saw it. One empty seat. It was at a small table near the edge of the atrium, tucked against the wall. Wide observation window that looked out into the stars, and across from the empty seat sat a young woman in a hover chair, perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap and her eyes open but staring at nothing. Nobody sat near her, and Kale thought that was strange, because the atrium was overflowing, and there were at least a dozen people standing with trays in their hands, looking for a place to sit. And yet this table had a wide circle of emptiness around it, like an invisible wall was keeping everyone away. Kale did not notice the crest on the hover chair, because it was angled away from him, and he would not have recognized it anyway, since he had never been to the Imperial Core Worlds, and could not tell the difference between a royal seal and a shipping label. He did not notice the 2 figures standing in the shadows 10 meters behind the woman, tall and wrapped in dark cloaks that seemed to drink the light around them, their faces hidden, that could cut through starship armor. He just saw an empty chair. He walked over and dropped his tray on the table with a loud clatter, and said, "This seat taken?" The woman did not respond. Kale looked at her for a moment, then shrugged and sat down, because on Dust Mara, silence meant yes, and if someone wanted you gone, they would tell you with their fist. The atrium went quiet. It did not go quiet all at once, but rather in a spreading wave, like a ripple moving outward from a stone dropped in still water, as table after table noticed the grease-covered human sitting across from the woman in the hover chair, and conversations died mid-sentence, and forks stopped halfway to mouths. And a diplomat from the Tessari Federation actually choked on his drink and had to be slapped on the back by his aide. The 2 shadow-cloaked figures behind the woman shifted, and their hands tightened on their weapons, and one of them took a step forward. Notice any of this, because he was already tearing into his food, which was some kind of station ration bar that tasted like cardboard mixed with regret. And between bites, he started talking. "You would not believe the day I have had," he said to the woman, chewing with his mouth half open, because manners were a luxury he had never been able to afford. "So this captain hires me to patch a hull breach on his freight hauler, right? And he tells me to do it fast, because he has a delivery schedule. So I work 14 hours straight, 14 hours with my hands inside a reactor housing that is still warm. And I get it done. And then he tells me the patch is not good enough and docks my pay by 40%. The woman did not react. 40%, Kale repeated, shaking his head. I told him the patch would hold for 6 months easy, and he could get a full replacement at the next station. But he did not want to hear it, and his first mate was standing behind him, cracking. His knuckles like that was supposed to scare me, and honestly, it did scare me a little, because the guy was about 8 feet tall and had 4 arms. He took another bite and kept going, talking about the bolt he dropped into a coolant line, and the hour he spent fishing it out with a magnetic probe, and the power coupling that sparked and singed his eyebrows off, and the way the captain's cat had climbed into the ventilation shaft, and he had to crawl in after it, because apparently the cat was worth more than Kale was. He talked and talked and talked, not because he expected answers, but because he was tired and lonely and far from home, and there was something about this quiet woman by the window that made him feel like it was okay to just let the words fall out of him. He did not know that the woman's name was Princess Seraphil Kale Domaris. He did not know that she was the only daughter of Emperor Domaris, the ruler of 11,000 worlds. Power for 200 years through genetic augmentation and a will made of cold iron. He did not know that 3 years ago, during an assassination attempt at a diplomatic summit, a neurotoxin weapon had struck her, a weapon designed not to kill, but to imprison, and it had destroyed her voluntary motor pathways and severed her neural speech centers, and locked her inside her own body, like a prisoner in a cell with no door. She was fully conscious, fully aware, fully intelligent, and completely trapped, unable to move or speak or even blink on command. And the galaxy had decided she was a living corpse, and the Emperor kept her in public as a monument to what his enemies had done, and a promise carved in silence of what he would do in return. Kale knew none of this. He just kept talking. When he finished eating, he gathered his tray and stood up and stretched, his joints popping loud enough to make the nearest sentinel wince behind its cloak. And he looked down at the woman and smiled the way someone smiles at a friend they have known for years, even though they just met. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "You are a good listener." He patted the table twice, turned around, and walked away, leaving greasy fingerprints on the polished surface. The atrium remained frozen for another 10 seconds after he left. In her hover chair, behind her unmoving face and her empty stare, Princess Seraphil felt something she had not felt in 3 years. The medical sensors woven into her chair detected it before anyone else could have noticed. A tiny spike in her heart rate, small and brief like the flicker of a candle flame in a dark room, but real and undeniable and alive. The sentinels noticed. They reported it to the Emperor. And somewhere on the throne world, a man who had not felt hope in 3 years read the report twice and then sat in silence for a very long time. Kale came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. It became a routine without him ever deciding it would be one. The way a river finds its path, not by choosing, but by flowing. And every time he had a break between repair jobs on the station, he would grab whatever cheap food the atrium vendors were selling, and walk to the same table by the observation window, and sit across from the woman who never moved, and never spoke, and never told him to leave. He talked about everything and nothing. He told her about Dust Mara, about the way the sky turned orange during the dust storms, and how his mother used to hang wet sheets over the windows to keep the grit out of the house, and about the first engine he ever took apart when he was 9 years old, a broken water pump his father had thrown away, and how he spread every piece across the kitchen floor and put it back together, and it worked, and his father had looked at him with something that might have been pride or might have been fear, because on Dust Mara, A boy who could fix things would never be allowed to leave. He told her stupid jokes that he had heard from dock workers and cargo haulers, and he told her about the stars he could name from the observation window. And one time he brought her a plate of food, even though she never ate, and he set it in front of her and said, "I got you the noodles because you look like a noodle person. I do not know why. It is just a feeling I have." She did not eat the noodles because she could not eat anything. Her body was fed through tubes that delivered nutrients directly into her blood. But Kale did not know that yet, and the noodles sat there getting cold, until a medical technician quietly removed them later. One afternoon, Kale noticed that one of the wheels on the underside of her hover chair was making a faint squeaking sound, a tiny imperfection that most people would never hear. But Kale was a mechanic, and wrong sounds were something he could not ignore, like splinters in his brain that he could not ignore. So he knelt down and pulled a small multi-tool from his belt and reached for the wheel. He made it about halfway before something cold and sharp pressed against the back of his neck. One of the sentinels had moved so fast and so silently that Kale had not heard a single footstep, and the blade at his neck was humming with an energy that made his teeth ache. And Kale froze, with his hands still outstretched, and his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. For 3 seconds nothing happened. Then something changed. Some invisible signal passed from somewhere to the sentinel, and the blade withdrew, and the shadow behind Kale melted back into its position 10 meters away, as if it had never moved at all. Kale let out a breath that shook his whole body, and slowly lowered his hand and whispered, "Okay, I will not touch the wheel." But the squeak kept bothering him, and 2 days later he came back with a tiny bottle of lubricant and fixed it when the sentinels were changing shifts, and nobody stopped him this time, and the squeak was gone, and he felt unreasonably proud of himself. It was the food vendor who told him the truth. A small, nervous creature with 6 eyes and trembling hands who sold fried dumplings from a cart near the observation window, and who had watched Kale sit at that table every day for 2 weeks with a growing sense of horror and amazement. "You do not know who she is," the vendor whispered one morning when Kale stopped to buy breakfast, and it was not a question. "She has not introduced herself," Kale said. The vendor told him everything, about the princess and the emperor and the assassination and the neurotoxin and the 3 years of silence. And by the time the vendor was finished, Kale's dumplings were cold, and his face was the color of old paper. He did not go to the table that day. He spent the whole day in his tiny rented quarters on the maintenance level of the station, sitting on his bunk with his head in his hands, thinking about the fact that he had been telling terrible jokes and complaining about his boss to the daughter of the most powerful man in the known galaxy, a man who could turn dust Mara into a cloud of gravel with a single order. He did not sleep that night, but the next morning he went back to the table. He sat down and looked at Seraphil and said, "So, I found out who you are, and I want you to know that I thought about running away, and I'm still thinking about it a little bit. But I figured if you wanted me gone, you would have had those shadow people slice me in half by now. So either you do not mind me being here, or you are playing a very long and complicated game. And honestly, either way, I am too tired to care." He started eating his dumplings. "Also," he said, "the noodles were a good choice. I stand by it." Far away on the throne world, Emperor Damaris received his daily report about the human mechanic, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not know what to feel. He had ruled 11,000 worlds for 2 centuries. He had crushed rebellions and ended wars, and shaped the fate of entire species. And he understood power and fear and loyalty and betrayal the way a musician understands notes. But he did not understand this. No one had spoken to his daughter as a person in 3 years. The doctors spoke about her, using words like prognosis and neural degradation and quality of remaining life, as if she were a broken instrument they were measuring for disposal. and the advisors spoke around her, discussing succession plans and political implications, while she sat motionless in the room with them. And the nobles spoke past her, offering hollow condolences that were really just attempts to position themselves closer to the throne. But this mechanic, this filthy underpaid human from a scrapyard nobody had ever heard of, sat across from her and talked to her about noodles. The Emperor did not understand it, but the reports from the medical sensors in Seraphiel's hover chair were impossible to ignore. Her heart rate was changing, not randomly, but in patterns that correlated with the mechanic's visits, rising slightly when he arrived and settling into a calm, steady rhythm while he talked, and spiking briefly when he said something funny. And the physicians had detected microelectrical impulses in her facial muscles, too small to produce visible movement, but large enough to show that somewhere beneath the silence her brain was trying to respond. Her neural scans, which had been flatlined in the emotional centers for 3 years, were showing activity again, faint but growing, like a light being turned on in a room that had been dark for so long everyone had forgotten it had a light at all. Something was waking up inside her, and the Emperor's physicians could not explain it. Meanwhile, Kale had begun to notice things that no medical scanner could measure. It was subtle, the kind of thing that most people would dismiss as imagination. But Kale had spent his entire life working with machines and listening to engines and feeling vibrations through his fingertips, and he had learned long ago that the difference between a machine that was working and a machine that was about to fail was often nothing more than a warp shift or a faint tremor that you could only detect if you were paying very close attention. He noticed that the skin on Seraphiel's hand was slightly warmer when he told jokes. He noticed that her breathing changed, just barely, when he talked about sad things, a tiny hitch that lasted less than a second. He noticed that on the days he arrived late, her heart rate on the monitor was different than on the days he arrived on time, and he started adjusting his stories based on what he sensed. Telling more jokes on the days she seemed low, and talking more quietly on the days she seemed tired. He was reading her the way he read engines, with his hands and his instincts, and the part of his brain that understood broken things. Words spread through the imperial court the way poison spreads through water, silently and everywhere at once. A human commoner sitting daily with the princess became a scandal that burned through the noble houses like fire through dry grass, and opinions split like cracked metal, some seeing it as an insult to the imperial bloodline, and others seeing it as a harmless curiosity, and others seeing something far more dangerous, a shift in the balance of power that they could not yet define, but could feel coming. Lord Victus Aaron felt it most of all. He was a military commander of immense influence, a tall, sharp-featured man with silver hair and cold eyes, who had spent the last 3 years carefully and quietly positioning himself. The natural choice for regent, since the princess was incapacitated, and the emperor could not rule forever, even with his augmentations. And Victus had built alliances and made promises and moved pieces across the board, with the patience of a man who knew that time was on his side. The mechanic threatened all of it, not because of what he was, but because of what he represented. The possibility that the princess might recover, that the silence might end, that the empty throne Victus had been building his future around might not stay empty. He began making plans. Kale was working late one night in a service corridor deep in the station's maintenance level, replacing a faulty power coupling in a section that nobody used, when 3 masked figures stepped out of the darkness ahead of him. They were professionals, moving with the kind of coordination that comes from training, and they carried short blades that hummed with the same energy Kale had felt against his neck. Weeks ago, Kale backed up and hit the wall behind him, and realized there was nowhere to go. Then the lights went out. When they came back on, 2 seconds later, the 3 attackers were on the floor, unconscious and crumpled like puppets with their strings cut, and standing behind Kale was a shadow so dark it seemed to have its own gravity. A sentinel, unseen and unheard, and absolutely unhesitating. It said nothing. It looked at Kale for one long moment, with eyes that reflected no light. Then it disappeared. Kale stood there shaking for 5 minutes before he could move his legs. The Emperor had made his decision. The mechanic lives. For now, the idea came to Kale, not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow leak, dripping into his brain over the course of many nights spent lying awake in his tiny quarters on the maintenance level, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman who could not speak. He was not a doctor, and he was not a scientist, and he had never been to a university or read a medical journal or done anything more complicated with biology than stitching a cut on his own arm with engine thread. But he understood systems, and a system was a system whether it was made of metal and wire or flesh and nerve. The problem was eating at him the way a rattling engine eats at a mechanic. Not because anyone asked him to fix it, but because the sound was there, and he could hear it, and his brain would not let it go. He started with the hover chair. The chair had a medical suite built into it, a network of sensors that monitored everything from Seraphil's heart rate to her neural activity to the chemical composition of her blood. And all of that data was displayed on a small screen on the back of the chair that nobody ever looked at, because the physicians did their analysis remotely, and the sentinels did not care about numbers. Kale started looking at the numbers. He could not access them directly because the system was locked behind Imperial medical encryption. But he did not need to hack it, because there was a junior medical technician assigned to monitor Seraphil's chair, a nervous four-armed alien named Fesic, who worked in 12-hour shifts and spent most of that time sitting in a monitoring room watching data scroll across a screen and being completely ignored by everyone. Fesic was young and lonely and terrified of his assignment, and had not spoken to anyone about his work in months, because nobody cared about the data coming from the chair of a woman the entire galaxy had given up on. Kale brought him dumplings. It took 3 visits, 5 orders of dumplings, before Fesic would even make eye contact with him, and another week before the technician would answer questions. But once he started talking, he could not stop, because someone was finally asking him about his work, and treating him like a person instead of a piece of furniture. And Kale realized with a sick feeling that Fesic and Seraphil had something in common. They were both invisible. Fesic showed him the data, all of it. 3 years of neural scans and motor pathway analyses and chemical profiles. And Kale sat in the monitoring room and stared at the screens for hours. And he did not understand most of what he was looking at. But he understood patterns, and he understood flow, and he understood what it looked like when a signal was trying to get from one place to another, and could not. "The physicians say the pathways are destroyed," Fesic said quietly, his 4 hands fidgeting with each other. "They say the toxin burned through the neural connections like acid through paper, and there is nothing left to repair." "Show me the scan from last week," Kale said. Fesic pulled it up. Kale stared at it for a long time. "That does not look destroyed to me," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you showed me a power cable that looked like that, I would not say it was burned through. I would say it was blocked, like something was sitting in the middle of the line, stopping the current from getting through. The cable is still there. The signal is still being generated, but something in between is eating it before it arrives." Fesic blinked all 6 of his eyes at once. "That is not how neural pathways work," he said. "Maybe not," Kale said, "but that is what it looks like." He went back to his quarters and could not sleep again, but this time it was not because of worry, but because his brain was on fire with the kind of energy that only came when he could see the shape of a solution hiding inside a problem. And he pulled out his tools and started sketching on the wall of his room with a grease pencil, drawing diagrams that were half circuit board and half something that looked like a nervous system, if a nervous system had been designed by a man who built engines for a living. The Imperial physicians had spent 3 years studying Seraphil's condition using the most advanced biological frameworks in the galaxy. Techniques developed over millennia by species that had been practicing medicine when humans were still living in caves. And they had concluded unanimously that the damage was permanent and irreversible, because they were looking for biological regeneration and finding none. They were looking at her as a body. Kale looked at her as a machine. And the difference between those two perspectives was the difference between giving up and seeing a way forward. Because a doctor looks at a severed nerve and says there is nothing to reconnect. But a mechanic looks at a blocked relay and says, I will just run a new wire around it. He called it a neural bypass rig. The concept was brutally simple in the way that only a human mind would consider simple. A mechanical interface that would intercept the signals Seraphiel's brain was still generating, route them around the blocked pathways through an external circuit, and deliver them to an output device that could translate those signals into movement or text. It was not elegant, and it was not biological, and no self-respecting physician in the galaxy would have considered it, because it treated the most sophisticated nervous system in existence like a broken fuel pump. But Kale was not a physician, and he had been fixing broken fuel pumps since he was 9 years old. He built the prototype in 6 days, using parts salvaged from a decommissioned navigation computer, medical-grade wiring that Fessick smuggled out of the supply room, and a diagnostic interface pulled from the engine of the same merchant ship whose captain had refused to pay him properly, which Kale considered a form of poetic justice. The Emperor was informed. The request to test the device on the princess went through 17 levels of imperial authority, and was rejected at 14 of them, before the Emperor himself intervened with a single word that overrode every objection, and that word was yes. Kale stood in Seraphiel's medical suite with the prototype in his hands, which were shaking, and the room was full of physicians who looked at him the way a group of master architects would look at a child who claimed he could fix a cathedral with a hammer. And the sentinels stood in the corners, like statues made of murder, and somewhere above them all, the Emperor watched through a holographic feed from the throne world. The prototype was ugly. There was no other word for it. A tangle of exposed wiring and clamps and circuit boards held together with solder and hope, strapped to a frame that Kale had bent by hand from salvaged hull plating. And it looked like something that belonged in a junkyard, not in the medical suite of a princess. Kale attached it to Seraphiel's arm, connecting the sensor pads to the skin above the major nerve clusters, and he calibrated the signal interceptors using the diagnostic interface, and he ran a test pulse through the system and checked the readings and adjusted the gain and checked again. And the whole time he was talking to her the way he always talked to her, quietly and steadily, telling her what he was doing and why, and that it was probably going to feel strange, and that if it hurt, she should let him know. And then he paused, because of course she could not let him know. And he said, well, if it hurts, I will figure it out. He activated the bypass. Nothing happened for 4 seconds. Then a cursor appeared on the small screen mounted to the frame. Blinked. And then it moved. Slowly, painfully, 1 pixel at a time, driven by signals that were traveling from Seraphiel's brain through the blocked wasteland of her nervous system and out through the bypass rig and into the screen. The cursor moved to a letter, then another, then another. The room was so silent that Kale could hear the hum of the station's gravity generators 3 floors below. Letters appeared on the screen, one at a time, with agonizing gaps between them. Youtalktoomuch. Kale read the words, and his vision blurred and his throat closed, and he laughed. He laughed so hard that tears ran down his face and dripped onto the bypass rig. And he could not stop laughing, because she was in there. She had always been in there, sharp and alive and waiting. And her first words in 3 years were an insult directed at the man who had saved her. The physicians stared at the screen with their mouths open, fainted, and hit the floor, with a sound like a bag of tools being dropped. On the throne world, Emperor Domerus watched the words appear on the screen through the holographic feed, and he closed his eyes, and his hands trembled, and for the first time in 3 years, the most powerful man in the galaxy looked like what he actually was, underneath all the power and the augmentation and the centuries of iron control. A father. And somewhere in the shadows of the imperial court, Lord Victus Aaron received a message from one of his informants, telling him what had happened in the medical suite on Celestine Ring. And he read it twice, and then set it down, and stared at the wall for a very long time. If the princess recovered, then everything he had built, and every alliance he had forged, and every promise he had made, was worth nothing. His face hardened like cooling metal. He began to plan something far more drastic than sending thugs after a mechanic. In the weeks that followed, Seraphiel became a person again. Not all at once, and not easily, but word by word and sentence by sentence, like someone climbing out of a well, using only their fingernails. She clawed her way back into the world of the living. Kale built a new version of the bypass rig every few days, each one better than the last, faster and more responsive and less painful. And by the second week, Seraphiel could type full sentences without pausing between letters. And by the third week, she could produce short paragraphs, and the words that came out of her were so sharp and so alive that they cut through the silence of 3 years like a blade through cloth. She was not what anyone expected. The galaxy had imagined that if the princess ever spoke again, her first real communications would be dignified and royal and measured, the words of an imperial heir reclaiming her position with grace. But Seraphiel had spent 3 years trapped inside her own skull with nothing to do but think and observe, and listen to every unguarded conversation held in her presence by people who assumed she was an empty shell. And what came out of her was not grace. It was fire. She was sarcastic and impatient and wickedly funny and absolutely furious, and she had opinions about everything and everyone. And the first time she typed a full paragraph, it was a detailed and devastating critique of the hairstyle of the senior physician, who had spent 3 years telling the emperor that his daughter was beyond help. Kale read it and laughed until his ribs hurt. "You have been saving that one for a while," he said. 3 years, she typed. "I have had time to compose several thousand reviews, and none of them are positive." Their conversations became the center of Kale's world, and he suspected they were the center of hers too, though she would never admit it, because admitting things was not something Seraphiel did. They argued about everything, about music and food and the proper way to fix a gravity calibrator, and she mocked his clothes and his accent and his habit of talking with his mouth full. And he mocked her royal formality, and the way she typed whom instead of who, and the fact that she had once used a semicolon in a text message. And underneath all the teasing and the banter, something real was growing between them. Not romance, not yet, but the kind of bond that forms between two people who recognize in each other the same fundamental loneliness. She told him things she had never told anyone. She told him about the assassination, about the moment the toxin hit her and the world went silent, about the 3 years of imprisonment inside her own body, about the horror of being conscious and aware and unable to scream, about the way people talked about her as if she were furniture, about the meetings held in her presence where advisors discussed whether it would be more politically advantageous to keep her alive or to let her die. And she told him all of this without self-pity, because self-pity required a softness that Seraphiel had burned out of herself long ago. And then she told him the thing that changed everything. "I know who ordered the assassination," she typed. Kale went still. "It was not an enemy nation," she typed. "It was not a foreign agent or a radical group or any of the suspects the imperial investigators spent 3 years chasing. It was someone inside the court, someone close to the throne, someone who sat in meetings about my condition and expressed sympathy and offered support and all the while knew that they were the one who put me here. Who? Kale whispered. Lord Victus Arin. The name hit Kale like a physical blow, because even a mechanic from Dustmara knew who Victus was. A military commander with enough ships under his command to conquer a small empire. A man who had been positioning himself as the natural successor to the throne for years. And Kale understood immediately what that meant. It meant that the most dangerous man in the galaxy after the Emperor himself was the same man who had the most to lose if Seraphiel recovered. Kale wanted to run. He wanted to pack his bag and get on the first ship heading for Dustmara, and disappear into the scrapyards, and never think about princesses or emperors or assassination plots ever again. Because he was a mechanic. He fixed engines. He was not equipped for this. And the gap between his world and this world was so vast that it made his head spin. But he looked at Seraphiel, at the bypass rig on her arm, and the screen where her words appeared one at a time. At the woman who had been trapped for 3 years, and was fighting her way back to life, with nothing but willpower and a crude machine built from scrap. And he could not leave. I have never left a job half-finished. She typed back, that is either very brave or very stupid. On Dustmara, those are the same thing. The Emperor summoned Kale to the throne world. The journey took 2 days by fast courier ship, and Kale spent both of those days in a state of terror so complete that he could not eat. And when he arrived on the throne world and was escorted through corridors of black marble and gold that stretched for miles, past guards and courtiers and officials who looked at him as if a particularly dirty piece of cargo had been delivered to the wrong address. His legs were shaking so badly, he was surprised they held him up. The throne room was a cathedral of power, a space so large and so dark that the ceiling was invisible, and the Emperor sat at the far end on a seat carved from a single piece of stone that was older than human civilization. And Emperor Damaris looked exactly like what he was. A being who had outlived generations and reshaped the galaxy according to his will, ancient and sharp and radiating a cold authority that pressed against Kale's chest like a weight. Kale stood before him, grease still under his fingernails, because some things do not wash off no matter how hard you scrub. And he waited. The Emperor studied him for a long time. She chose you, the Emperor said finally, and his voice was quiet and low and carried the weight of centuries. I do not understand why, but my daughter's judgment has always been better than mine. He granted Kale full access to imperial medical resources, the finest equipment and materials in the galaxy, and Kale thanked him and turned to leave, and was almost at the door when the Emperor spoke again. If you fail her, he said, there will be no place in this galaxy or any other where you can hide from me. Kale nodded because there was nothing else to do when a man who commanded 11,000 worlds made a promise like that, and he left the throne world and went back to Celestine Ring and got to work. The attack came 3 weeks later. Lord Victus had spent years building a network of loyalists in key military positions, officers who owed him favors, and commanders who shared his ambitions, and soldiers who followed orders without asking questions. And with the princess recovering, and the threat of exposure growing by the day, he could not afford to wait any longer. He launched his strike, disguised as a pirate raid. A force of 200 soldiers, in unmarked armor, hitting Celestine Ring through the maintenance docks on the lower levels, moving fast and hard toward the medical wing where Seraphiel was being treated. The station shook with the first explosion, and alarms screamed to life in every corridor. Kale was with Seraphiel in the medical suite when the lights flickered and the floor trembled, and the sound of weapons fire echoed through the walls. The sentinels moved immediately, flowing out of the room like shadows, pouring through cracks, and they were devastating in combat. But there were only 4 of them, and Victus had sent an army. Kale looked at Seraphiel, and Seraphael looked at the screen of her bypass rig and typed 2 words. Fix this. Kale did what he knew how to do. He ran to the engineering panel on the wall and ripped it open and plunged his hands into the wiring of the station, like a surgeon reaching into a patient's chest. And he rerouted the power grid to seal blast doors in the corridors leading to the medical wing. And he vented coolant from the thermal regulation system into the hallways to create freezing barriers that forced the attackers to slow down. And he overloaded the lighting systems in the occupied corridors to create blinding strobes that disoriented the soldiers. And he reprogrammed the station's maintenance drones, small machines designed for cleaning and minor repairs, and turned them into swarms of kamikaze defenders that flew into the attackers' visors and jammed their weapons and tangled in their legs. He turned Celestine Ring into a weapon because to a mechanic, everything is a machine, and every machine can be made to fight. But the attackers kept coming. A stray energy blast hit the medical suite, and the bypass rig on Seraphiel's arm sparked and died, and the screen went dark, and she was cut off again, silent and immobile, and alone in the middle of a battle. And Kale was in the corridor outside the suite, trying to hold a junction point, and he did not know the rig was down. An attacker rounded the corner and fired, and the blast caught Kale in the shoulder and spun him against the wall, and he went down hard, and the attacker advanced with his weapon raised, and Kale could see the end coming, clear and simple and final. In the medical suite, Seraphiel felt the explosion and heard the weapons fire, and knew that Kale was in danger. She could not see him, but she could feel it the way you feel a storm approaching. And something inside her that was deeper than the toxin, and deeper than the damage, and deeper than 3 years of silence, rose up like a tide. She fought, not with words and not with technology, but with raw and absolute will, pushing against the blockage in her nervous system with everything she had, screaming inside her own skull, with a fury that had been building for 3 years. And the pain was beyond anything she had ever felt, like fire running through every nerve in her body at once. Her hand moved. 3 inches. Just enough to reach the emergency alert panel on the armrest of her hover chair. And her finger pressed the button. And the station's emergency lockdown activated, and blast doors slammed shut throughout the ring, trapping the attackers in kill zones, where the sentinels could reach them. Seraphiel seized, her body convulsing, as the effort tore through her damaged nervous system. And the monitors screamed. And her heart stopped for 9 seconds, and the medical systems fought to bring her back. And for those 9 seconds, the universe held its breath. Then her heart beat again. The sentinels finished the attackers in the silence that followed. Kale dragged himself back to the medical suite with blood running down his arm, and found Seraphiel in her chair, with her hands still resting on the emergency panel and the monitors showing vital signs that were weak but steady. And he knelt beside her and took her hand, the hand she had moved to save him, and held it. And she could feel it. For the first time since the toxin took everything from her, she could feel the warmth of another person's hand in hers, rough and calloused and shaking and alive. Victus escaped the station before the lockdown caught him, but the evidence his soldiers left behind was more than enough to connect him to the attack. And when the Emperor received the report, his response was not anger. It was something much worse than anger. It was patience. 6 months passed, and the galaxy changed. Lord Victus Aaron was found on a frozen moon at the edge of Imperial space, hiding in a bunker buried beneath a kilometer of ice, with a small army of loyalists who had followed him into exile. And the Emperor did not send a fleet to destroy him, because destruction was not what the Emperor had in mind. The Sentinels went alone. When they brought Victus back to the throne world in chains, the trial was held in the Great Hall of Echoes, a chamber so vast that words spoken at one end took 3 seconds to reach the other. and the chamber was filled with representatives from every major house and every allied species and every corner of the empire, because the emperor wanted witnesses. Seraphil gave her testimony. She sat in a new hover chair that Kale had built for her, sleek and elegant and humming with quiet power, nothing like the crude prototype he had strapped together from scrap, and the bypass rig was no longer a tangle of exposed wires, but a seamless system integrated into the chair's frame, and her words appeared on a large display beside her, clear and sharp and devastating. She told them everything. She told them about the moment the toxin hit her and the world went dark, and about the 3 years of silence that followed, and about the meetings she had witnessed from inside her prison, where Victus sat across the table from her father, and expressed sympathy and pledged loyalty, while knowing that he was the one who had put her there. And she told them about the specific words he had used, the dates and times and locations, because she had been listening for 3 years with nothing else to do, and her memory was perfect. Victus stood in chains and watched his entire life collapse sentence by sentence. The Emperor's judgment was not death. Death was too simple and too kind for the man who had stolen his daughter's voice. And the Emperor had spent 6 months thinking about what justice looked like when the crime was not murder, but something worse than murder. Something that left the victim alive and aware and screaming in silence. The sentence was called the silence. Imperial physicians, using the same class of neurotoxin that had been used on Seraphil, but refined and calibrated and made permanent, induced in Victus the exact condition he had inflicted on the princess. Voluntary motor pathways severed, neural speech centers destroyed, consciousness preserved. He would spend the rest of his life aware and trapped and unable to move or speak or blink. There would be no bypass rig for him. There would be no mechanic who wandered to the wrong table. There would be only silence, forever. The great hall was quiet for a long time after the sentence was read. Kale watched from the back of the chamber, standing in the shadows near the service entrance, because he did not belong in the front rows with the nobles and the diplomats, and he felt something complicated twist in his chest. Not satisfaction, and not pity, but something in between, that he did not have a word for. After the trial, the Emperor summoned him again. This time, the throne room did not feel quite as terrifying, or maybe Kale was just getting used to being terrified, and the Emperor looked at him with an expression that Kale had never seen on that ancient face before. Something that might have been warmth, if it had been on anyone else's face. "I owe you a debt that cannot be measured," the Emperor said. "Name what you want, and it is yours. Title, lands, wealth, a command, anything within my power to give." Kale thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "I want a workshop," he said. "A proper one, with good lighting and tools that are not held together with welding tape. And maybe a chair that does not have a spring poking through the seat." The court advisors who were present stared at him. He had asked for the Emperor's crown and then set it on fire. The Emperor studied him for a long time, and then made a sound that several courtiers later swore was a laugh, though none of them could confirm it because none of them had ever heard the Emperor laugh before. Kale was granted the title of Imperial Artificer, a position that had not existed in the Empire for centuries, created specifically for him, and his mandate was simple and impossible: to apply the human way of thinking, the mechanic's way of seeing the universe as a system that could be understood and repaired, to problems across the Empire that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had declared unsolvable. It turned out there were many such problems. A species on the outer rim whose artificial atmosphere was failing, because the alien engineers who built it had designed it as a closed biological system, and could not see that it was behaving like a leaking pressure vessel. And Kale fixed it. In 2 weeks, with a patch that the original builders called barbaric, and the inhabitants called a miracle. A communication network spanning 3 star systems that had been losing signal for decades because the alien technicians kept looking for software errors, when the problem was a physical harmonic vibration in the relay towers that Kale could feel in his teeth when he stood next to them. A species of aquatic beings whose underwater cities were slowly sinking because their architects designed in curves and flows and could not conceive of the rigid support structures that a human child would have recognized as the solution. Kale fixed them all, not because he was smarter than the alien scientists and engineers who had failed before him, but because he saw things differently, because the human brain had evolved in a specific environment under specific pressures, and it had developed a way of looking at the universe that was unique among all the species in the galaxy. Way that treated everything, from a broken pump to a dying atmosphere to a princess trapped in silence, as a machine that could be taken apart and understood and put back together. And that was the thing about humans that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. They did not give up on broken things. Meanwhile, Seraphiel was recovering. The bypass rig, combined with targeted therapy guided by Kale's circuit mapping of her nervous system, was gradually retraining her neural pathways, forcing new connections to grow around the damaged areas, the way a river forces new channels around a landslide. And she was regaining movement, piece by piece. First her hands, then her arms, then slow and halting steps that took all of her concentration and left her exhausted. And each milestone was a battle fought in pain and won in stubbornness. And Kale was there for every one of them, adjusting the rig and calibrating the signals and catching her when she fell. Terrible jokes when she cried. She would never fully recover, and they both knew it. She would always need the rig, and she would always move slower and speak with more effort and tire more quickly than she had before. And there would be days when her body refused to cooperate, and the old silence crept back in around the edges. But she was present, and she was heard, and she was herself. And that was enough. That was everything. The ceremony was held 6 months after the trial, in the atrium on Celestine Ring where it all began, and the space had been transformed into a glittering hall draped in imperial colors, with dignitaries from 100 species filling every seat, and the artificial sky overhead set to a deep and endless blue. Seraphiel stood. She stood on her own 2 feet, supported by an exoskeletal rig that Kale had built into the framework of her formal gown, because of course he had made it functional and beautiful. Because somewhere along the way, Mechanic from Dust Mara had learned that the best machines are the ones you cannot see. And she walked to a podium at the center of the hall, with steps that were slow and careful and unsteady and absolutely unstoppable. The hall went silent. She spoke. Her voice came through a vocal synthesizer that Kale had tuned to match her original voice, using old recordings. And it was not perfect, and it was not smooth, and there were pauses and catches and moments where the technology stuttered. But it was hers, and everyone in the hall knew it. She spoke about silence. She spoke about what it meant to be unseen and unheard, to exist in a room full of people who looked through you as if you were glass. And she spoke about the broken things in the universe, the people and the systems and the worlds that everyone walks past, because fixing them would be difficult and thankless and uncertain. And she spoke about the rare and stubborn and unreasonable people. Stop. She spoke about humanity, this strange and grease-stained species that looks at the impossible and says, "Have you tried turning it off and back on again?" This species that treats a princess the same as a broken engine, not with reverence or pity, but with the simple, honest belief that anything broken can be made to work if you care enough to sit down and figure out how. She did not say Kale's name. She did not need to. When the ceremony was over and the dignitaries had filed out and the hall was emptying, Kale walked back to the atrium, to the same table by the observation window where he had sat down with his terrible station food on the worst day of his life. And he sat in the same chair and unwrapped a ration bar and started eating. The hover chair glided up beside him. Seraphiel had chosen to sit rather than stand, because she was tired, and she was learning to be kind to herself about that, and she looked at him with eyes that were no longer empty. Eyes that held 3 years of darkness and 6 months of fighting, and the sharp bright fire of a woman who had come back from the dead. "This seat taken?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and mechanical and imperfect, and it was the most beautiful sound Cale had ever heard. He grinned, the way he had grinned on that first day, the way someone grins at a friend they have known forever. "It has always been yours," he said. She sat. They ate together in the glow of the observation window, with the stars stretched out behind them like a map of everywhere they had been and everywhere they were going. And around them the galaxy kept spinning, vast and ancient, and full of species that had mapped every star and solved every equation, and reached the edge of knowledge, and built civilizations that would last until the heat death of the universe. But it took a human with engine grease on his hands to fix what they could not. Things and walk away. They sit down.